The linguistics field is the latest realm to face a debate over cancel culture involving prominent linguistic scholar Dr. Steven Pinker. In a letter to the Linguistic Society of America, 469 signatories used Pinker's tweets and past statements as evidence to ask for his removal from the organization.
However, one of the fathers of modern linguistics, Professor Noam Chomsky's name was notably absent from that letter. He told friend of the show, Zaid Jilani, that the letter represented meat for the right's love of cancel culture in explaining why he did not sign. And Zaid joins us now via Skype for more. Great to see you, Zaid.
Good to see you, Zaid.
Good to be here.
Can you just give us kind of the context here? What were the offenses that were cited in the letter? How did this come to be? And then what did Chomsky tell you?
Yeah, so basically there was an open letter. It was hundreds of students, but also quite a few faculty, people who worked in the field of linguistics, kind of writing to the LSA, which is a major kind of linguistic studies, the major organization for people in the field, asking the Linguistic Studies Association to basically remove Pinker from a list of academic fellows, fairly prestigious position in the field. And so, I was curious, what does Noam Chomsky feel about this? He's one of the kind of academic godfathers of the field. He revolutionized linguistics in the 60s and 70s. So I wrote to him, and he basically told me he doesn't support things like this. The main reason the letter existed is because Steven Pinker had tweeted a number of things that were basically links to studies showing that the police shooting issue is not primarily an issue of racial bias. There's other factors as well. I believe he had tweeted something also saying that there was not some kind of pandemic of kind of like gender terrorism or something after a shooting by kind of like an extremist on the right. Basically, it was fairly mild things. It was mostly factual kind of studies and empirical claims. It wasn't really even that much in terms of opinions, but I think that the people on the letter saw him as being insufficiently supportive of Black Lives Matter. That was the main kind of case that they were raising. And they largely pointed to tweets that he had made, I think, numbers of years ago.
Yeah, 5 years ago,
making
right.
various empirical claims. Right.
Yeah, I mean, so let's talk about that. I mean, just in terms of what was his main objection to this, and what has his been kind of long-standing position on free speech and just his lack of want in order to engage in these types of things?
Yeah, so Chomsky, he was someone who was a leading academic critic of the Vietnam War in the early 60s. And that was a time when it really wasn't easy to be an early critic of the Vietnam War. He would try to hold meetings even in Boston, a very liberal city, and they'd be broken up because there would be so many threats of violence. He'd have to have armed security even to hold a meeting. I think that made an impression on him. He came to see freedom of speech as kind of an inalienable right, kind of something that you absolutely needed to have in order to function in a free society. And it's interesting, even at that time, he was probably the leading critic of the Vietnam War of any American intellectual during that time. And I believe MIT hired Walt Rustow, who was one of the Vietnam War architects, to teach. And Chomsky and some students were asked about this, and Chomsky said, we believe this war criminal has a right to teach. I mean, that was his phrasing, right? So even in cases where he was very strongly opposed to the person, he still kind of defended their right. And this goes all the way up through the 90s, where he was embroiled in sort of a controversy, because I believe there was a man in one of the EU who had made some remarks questioning the Holocaust, and Chomsky said, well, obviously I strongly disagree with that, but they were actually waging criminal charges against them, and Chomsky said, the state shouldn't have a right to put someone in jail just for being ignorant. So Chomsky's had that position for a very long time, so it wasn't really surprising in some ways.
We actually have a clip of him explaining some of those exact views. Let's take a look at that.
I mean, Goebbels was in favor of freedom of speech for views he liked, right? So was Stalin. If you're in favor of freedom of speech, that means you're in favor of freedom of speech precisely for views you despise. Otherwise, you're not in favor of freedom of speech. There's two positions you can have on freedom of speech. Now, you can decide which position you want.
And I think that's such an important point, Zed, is that it matters the most when it's a view that you find actually abhorrent. And I think this is very selectively used all the way around. The right will be the first to be, oh my God, cancel culture, and you can't just cancel everybody. But the moment that you say something they don't like or something that's offensive to them, then it's like, oh my goodness, give me the smelling salts. So the point is you can't selectively use this, because Chomsky is someone who has lived a life in which he knows what it looks like to be silenced for views that are legitimate. And if it comes for someone that you find abhorrent now, it can very easily come for you later.
Yeah, and I think that's generally the point that Chomsky has made, is that this is sort of a, it's kind of like rules in a chess game. Everyone kind of has to agree to the rules. Sometimes they'll benefit you, sometimes they'll benefit your opponent. But if everyone agrees, then you can kind of have fairness. And I think there's also a larger point here besides the freedom of speech point, which is that I think right now, if you look through this letter, it's not just students. It's not just like a bunch of 19-year-olds. There's just tons of professors, tons of faculty. And I'm curious if some people signed the letter because they felt like if they didn't sign the letter, they'd be signaling that they weren't supportive of Black Lives Matter, they were not supportive of police reform, so on and so forth. Even though, by the way, Steven Pinker is supportive of those things. He just happened to tweet some studies that call into question maybe some parts of it, some empirical facts. And I think that larger problem of making decisions based on fear is also very problematic, because that leads to groupthink. It means that you're not having someone in the room to question your premises, to push back on you, to help tighten up your arguments and kind of see your blind spots. And, that's led to everything from the Bay of Pigs disaster to the Challenger shuttle disaster, where there were people in the room who had some qualms, but they were kind of shushed or shut out of the debate or told not to air them. It's best just to all be on board. And I think when we do that, sometimes we're unable to see the flaws in our own argument to tighten them, even if we are supportive of the larger cause.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Zed, one of the counter argument that I see made is basically like, first of all, this whole thing is overblown. There's not some, endemic cancel culture that's just like ripping the country apart. And second of all, the idea that we've had too much accountability seems silly, right? The problem is we haven't had enough accountability. So if you occasionally have a case that goes too far in one direction or the other, that is the outlier. The actual problem is that you have too little accountability within the system. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think this is more of an issue of debate and the value of having debates and the value of having different views than it is an issue of accountability. I can't imagine this is something to hold Steven Pinker accountable for, is for, tweeting a study by Roland Fryer, a Harvard academic, and actually a Black prodigy. I think he was the youngest Black person to ever receive that position at Harvard, the author of the study that he tweeted, which is the ironic part. I don't think that's an issue of accountability. When I think accountability, I think of someone who committed a crime, some major transgression. I think scaling that concept down to just people we disagree with it can be very unhelpful, because then everything's a nail when all you have is a hammer. So I don't necessarily view it as a matter of accountability. I think of Jeffrey Epstein as a matter of someone who escaped accountability, right? Yes. Someone who had committed a series of crimes and it was hidden. Scaling that concept out into, well, there's people who we disagree with, they should be held accountable for disagreeing. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So.
Yeah, and I'm somebody who hates Steven Pinker because I always hear libertarians cite his book about how we're living in the greatest age of modern history. So that's just my personal. I really despise the man and much of what he's put out there, but don't want to see him lose his job or anything like that. Zed, I know that you're working on a new project. I want to give you the chance to preview it, and so some people can go subscribe to it. Yeah,
so my friend Leighton Woodhouse and I, we had previously worked together on a podcast. We're starting a YouTube channel called The Back Channel. And basically the goal of that will be to have kind of conversations on underreported stories and narratives. Our first episode features Kamel Foster and Katie Herzog talking about the book White Fragility, which is one of the best-selling books in America. And they've actually read through it, and they have some really interesting things to say about it. So,
yeah,
great.
Awesome.
When is that up? When will it be up? Can people subscribe now?
Yeah, it's up on YouTube. You can search for The Back Channel, White Fragility, Kamel Foster, my name, and then you can subscribe as well.
Great.
Fantastic.
Well, everybody should do that. So
Absolutely.
Thank you, Zed. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Zed.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.